Welcome here today. I just want to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose land we're meeting here for this very important conversation, particularly when we're talking about the future of not just our country but the rest of the world, our sustainability, the ability to live in harmony with nature, and as Clive has written in his latest book, Living Hot, to learn about how we respond to changes in nature and to adapt. And we're going to get into that conversation a little bit later. But again, thank you for being here for this book launch. I'm Stan Grant here at Sturt University, but some of you know me? Some of you know me. Some have even said they miss me on the ABC, but I can't say I miss being there, so I'm happy to be here. We're here for the launch of Clive Hamilton's new book, Living Hot. I could list all of Clive's achievements and all of the books that Clive's written, but I think Clive summed up who he is most aptly in the title of one of his books, Provocateur. And Clive has certainly been provoking us to think in new and different ways, challenging us to think outside of whatever orthodox positions that we may have, and to ask ourselves what it is to live together in a world that is straining at the seams in so many ways. And no more so than in this latest book, Living Hot. Clive's going to speak to us in just a moment, and this book focuses on the question of how we live in a different world. What is it to live in a world that is going to be hotter, that is going to be more volatile and more unpredictable? Where are we right now? What are we doing right? And what do we need to change? So Clive will be speaking to us, then we'll be coming to our panel conversation after that. So let me introduce now to speak about his book for about 15 minutes or so before our panel conversation, Clive Hamilton.
Many thanks, Stan. I appreciate that. And let me thank the panellists for agreeing to come along and talk about this book. And welcome to the Vice-Chancellor, Renée Leon, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor Mark Evans, who initiated this event. So thanks, Mark. And also to my co-author, George Wilkenfeld, who's here with us today and may well get an opportunity to respond to questions later on. Okay, well, based on the evidence, it's unlikely that global emissions will stabilise and then decline steeply enough over the next decades to prevent the Earth becoming at least 2.5 degrees and possibly even 3.5 degrees warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. It's actually hard to picture what life will be like with warming of, say, 3 degrees. But let me just mention a 2021 study that assessed the unequal burden of extremes across generations. On the 3-degree warming trajectory expected from current climate pledges, a child born in 2020 can expect to live through 7 times more extreme heat waves through their lives than someone born in 1960. The study showed that if warming is held to no more than 2 degrees, which is exceptionally optimistic in my view, so almost certain to exceed that, children born today can expect to live through 5 times more extreme heat waves. Now those numbers are for a global child. The exposure of Australian children to danger will vary by income, by education, and of course by geography. But the point is all too apparent. Even under more optimistic scenarios, children alive today and those still to be born will need to learn to cope with much more frequent and dangerous extreme events. Australia is powerless to stop these global trends. Decisions determining whether the world reaches net zero sooner or later are being made not in Canberra, but in Washington, New Delhi, Moscow, Brussels, and above all in Beijing. Beijing accounts for nearly 30% of total global emissions. Australia accounts for just over 1% of the world's emissions, so our efforts will be barely noticed by the global climate. If we include emissions from our fossil fuel exports, Australia accounts for about 3% of global emissions. If we rapidly phased out their export on moral grounds, which I would support, it would not make a noticeable difference to global emissions because Japan and South Korea would buy their coal from Indonesia instead. Australia once had the opportunity to show global leadership, but that time has passed. Even if we could inspire the rest of the world, elevated levels of CO2 already in the atmosphere will keep global temperatures high for centuries. Slow processes like melting ice masses, thawing tundra, and rising sea levels are in effect irreversible once they begin, and there are signs that some tipping points may already have been crossed. Common sense tells us that this is the future Australians must prepare for. The climate that we're familiar with, the one that has shaped the way we live and work in cities, towns, and the bush, will be transformed in the next decades into one more unfamiliar, chaotic, and dangerous. Australians, of course, have always lived with heat, fire, flood, and drought. But climate change is multiplying and supercharging extreme weather events to the point where they are overwhelming our accustomed ways of coping. And yet debate in Australia over climate policy is built on an implicit belief that what we do in this country to reduce our emissions can change the climate Australians will be living through in 50 or 100 years' time. The Labor government's climate policy, for instance, is promoted as a plan to secure the nation's future. The struggle over climate policy has been so intense and the present positions so hard won that people committed to climate action have trouble pulling back and taking stock of our actual prospects. Wishful thinking prevails everywhere. Aside from undead nuclear plans, continuing faith in carbon capture and storage is the most striking example. George and I are adding to this new articles of faith, radical decarbonisation schemes, notably Ross Garnaut's renewable energy superpower, but also Alan Finkel's electrostate and Saul Griffith's vision to electrify everything. Regrettably, because we want those things to work, but as we show in Living Hot, these each turn out to be beyond what is feasible and plausible, at least at the scale promised, and certainly in the time frames proposed. And they would have some very unwelcome side effects. Fully decarbonising electricity supply would require 4 times as much wind and solar generation as we have now. Fair enough. I want to see that. Replacing natural gas and petroleum use with clean electricity would need an additional 8 times as much, 12 in total so far. If we also replace our fossil fuel exports with green hydrogen, we will need to build 100 times as many solar and wind farms as we have now. Even conversion of domestic energy to clean electricity will entail a vast expansion of the mining industry. And many of those mines are in areas set aside for biodiversity conservation. Some net zero plans rely on allocating vast expanses of land to carbon-storing trees, vegetations and soils. Ross Garnaut's book estimates we'd need to plant out 10% of the entire continent's land area. Already, the rollout of some renewable energy infrastructure is causing lasting damage to elements of the natural environment, elements that we'll prize ever more highly as our climate shifts. Snowy 2.0 is a case in point. So would the proposed Robbins Island wind farm off northwest Tasmania. Now, George and I have been staunch advocates of renewables since about the mid-1990s, so we're pretty long in the tooth in this debate. But we're increasingly alarmed by the impacts of climate change in Australia, and so we've concluded in our book that if protecting our increasingly precious landscapes, seascapes and ecosystems means a slower rollout of renewables and a greater use of natural gas, then so be it. There's little sense in destroying the very natural assets we're trying to preserve. There are also real concerns about how some solar and wind farms, along with the wires connecting them to the grid, are jeopardising our food security that Australians will value even more highly as the world enters a long era of climatic transformation. The area of arable land is already shrinking due to climate change, and farm productivity is declining and is expected to decline further. Of course, Australia should continue to cut emissions rapidly, even though it can have no appreciable effect on global heating. It's the right thing to do, for one. Australia has been free riding on other nations for far too long. It's also in our economic interests, because without rapid adoption of clean energy technology, our industries would quickly become outdated, and our exports may be excluded from important markets such as the European Union. Our concern in Living Hot is that the public is being lulled into a false sense that enough is being done to make a difference to our future climate. And that's preventing us from coming to grips with the one thing that really could secure our nation's future. That is, implementing a far-reaching national program to prepare Australia for life in a hotter and more dangerous climate. Making the nation resilient will mean transforming everything from where we live and the dwellings we live in, to city planning, transport infrastructure, water management, farming, coastal management, and biodiversity conservation, to name only the more obvious parts of it. Yet public debate over preparing for a more punishing climate is barely on the radar. In July last year, the CEOs of peak bodies in the building, planning and insurance industries called on state governments to change their land use planning to, quote, ensure no new homes are built without regard for flood risks. Considering everything we know and have known for a long time, it's scarcely believable that in 2023 industry leaders should feel the need to tell governments, don't build on floodplains. In April this year, the Hawkesbury River flooded for the 7th time in 4 years, badly affecting farmers and homeowners on the lowlands, some of whom can no longer obtain insurance cover. The Mayor of Hawkesbury Council is lobbying for the raising of Warragamba Dam so people can continue to live on the floodplain. Raising the dam would flood 6,000 hectares of ecologically sensitive World Heritage area and inundate a trove of Indigenous cultural sites. By contrast, when the town of Grantham in Queensland was devastated by flood in 2011, within days, the Mayor, Steve Jones, a rather heroic figure in my view, promised to shift the town onto a nearby hill and that work would begin within 12 months. It was a crazy promise that would require a superhuman effort and the cooperation of local, state and federal governments. Even so, orchestrated by a savvy and determined mayor, it worked. And 2 years later, Grantham residents sitting high and dry watched the next flood wash through the old town. There are precedents in Australia. In the 19th century, several towns, including Bega, Nowra and Gundagai, were shifted entirely onto higher ground after catastrophic floods. In December 1916, the central Queensland town of Clermont was hit by a wall of water following a tropical cyclone, killing more than 60 residents. The township was rebuilt out of harm's way after residents took up the offer of land grants made available by an act of the Queensland Parliament. Governments have been dragging their feet, although it should be said Queensland is a bit ahead of the other states. The policy emphasis has been back to front. Almost all the attention is on the transition to renewables and very little on what we should be doing to ready ourselves for the stresses and calamities that are surely coming, in fact, that are already here. Australia spends, according to the Productivity Commission, 97% of disaster funding on clean-up and recovery and only 3% on measures to prevent the damage in the first place. The official framework for adapting to climate change remains a COAG agreement drawn up in 2012. Awareness of the dangers of climate change has grown enormously in the 12 years since then. No expert believes we can avoid severe impacts. Yet that COAG agreement remains the foundation of the government's new adaptation strategy being formulated now. The agreement reflects a dated free market worldview that dumps most responsibility on individuals and private businesses, arguing it's more efficient for private parties to, quote, manage their own risks. It's best, COAG agreed back then, to leave it mostly to the market, which is a recipe for penalising the poor and vulnerable. We're not leaving climate protection to individuals. The federal government is telling local or has been telling local councils that they should do the heavy lifting. But as the catchphrase goes, the feds have the money, the states have the power, and local governments have the responsibility. A few councils have well thought out plans to protect their communities, but they have neither the money nor the powers to follow through. Our three-tier structure of government is failing us badly, once again, and we urgently need to negotiate a new COAG adaptation agreement, one based on the latest climate science, an agreement that recognises we need coordinated planning over several decades if we are to upgrade our infrastructure and retrofit millions of homes. The Biden White House has a policy announced in 2023 that goes some way towards that. If we don't prepare together for life in an increasingly stressful climate, we know what will happen. The rich will spend up on their own protection, while the poor and vulnerable will be left to fend for themselves. Making ourselves ready for what we know is coming, and doing so in cooperative ways, is not only common sense, but an insurance policy for social justice in times of growing danger. Globally, we in Australia are in the best position to survive and perhaps even thrive in the new conditions we'll have to cope with in the decades to come. And we can begin now. We don't have to wait for any kind of technological breakthrough. We have the opportunity to make a nation in which the next generations can survive and even live well in the different kind of earth that is our future. Thank you.
Put another seat up for Senator David Pocock, who's about to join us. Just to introduce our panel who'll be with us. Michelle Grattan, who needs no introduction to Parliament House, but is also Chief Political Correspondent for The Conversation at the moment, and joins us a great friend of Charles Sturt University, and I've enjoyed many wonderful conversations with Michelle at events just like this. Clive, of course, you've heard from Senator Nick McKim from the Greens, Bridget Archer from Liberal MP, and David Pocock, the late David Pocock, who's just arrived to join us.
Not dead yet.
Not dead yet. I might start just, Michelle, with your thoughts, listening to what Clive has outlined in terms of how we need to prepare for living in a different world, and getting your observations on whether we're ready to do that politically, given what we've seen around the politics of climate change over the past couple of decades.
Well, look, I think that the Living Hot book is a wake-up call, does show that we can't just say if current targets are met, it's all going to be fine and we're doing our part. We're still going to have a problem at the end of the day, and it's going to be a very challenging, very expensive problem to address. And I guess that's a hard admission for governments to make, because there's been so much stress, as Clive was saying, on the targets, on getting emissions down on that part of the agenda. So is the present government wanting to say, well, we know really this is only going to be part of a solution. We have to do all these things that are going to be quite challenging, not least because we'd have to get the Federation into a better state than it is at the moment. And on the other side, the opposition is already contesting the costs of what is being done, And so it would be pretty reluctant to embrace an agenda that would mean much more of a burden financially, much more of a planning interventionist policy. So I do think it is a big ask, although probably a very necessary ask.
I'll go to you, Bridget, on this as well. Part of what we've seen from the previous government and the position of the coalition has been around technologies and the way that the use of other technologies, and we'll come to the nuclear question a little bit later, but the way that technology can offset some of the impact and lead us to the sort of achieving the sort of targets that we need. Listening to what Clive has outlined today and the necessity to live well in a changed world, what role does technology play in that?
Look, I think it.
Is yours doing the same as mine?
I don't know if you can hear
Slipping
me.
away. Yeah, we can hear you.
You know, I think that of course there's a role for technology to play, but I think that we never quite get to the role that technology can play because we don't overcome the sort of inertia that exists in doing anything at all. And so I think, I think there are solutions there, and but what is needed is a commitment to actually move towards taking that action in the first place. And we've seen a lot of arguing over a long period of time in terms of emissions reduction that's ongoing. And what actually happens is nothing. You know, I think that in between you just get inertia. And I actually think we see this across sort of whole of government. Some of the things that you were saying, I think you could directly apply to our health system as well, you know, that we're focusing on sort of this one end of the health system, and we, even though it would probably cost us less and in some ways would be politically easier to do more prevention, we don't do it. And I think this is true. In some ways, I think that what is proposed in the book is maybe politically easier in some ways, that if you can't...
It's a different conversation with
It's a different conversation,
Are we ready to have that, particularly when we could be at an election later this year or early next year?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to maybe just change the narrative and actually talk about tangible things that can be done in communities now that are going to have benefits, a whole range of benefits in terms of coping with those changing climate or weather, if you want to call it the weather, conditions, but also I think, you know, there are economic benefits that can be had for communities through some of these actions as well. We talk about sort of, you know, growing sort of sovereign capacity within the country and all of these sorts of things. I think it's a way, a lens, I think, of looking at a different way and being able to maybe take the narrative out of that sort of ideological space to practical action.
It certainly would be a change, Nick McKim, to take it out of the ideological space, but we know that that's not how politics works. We saw the impact that the Teals had at the last election, emerging out of particularly frustration around climate policy. What are your thoughts on listening to what Clive has to say and how receptive the public may be to that, given what is required to get to the point where we are living well in a changed environment, which is going to ask a lot of all of us, including having to change in some cases where we live.
Yeah, change where we live and change how we live. And a lot of what Clive has said today is typically intelligent and incisive, and also typically, and I mean this as a compliment, Clive, provocative. And the fact that Clive's going to get us all talking about these things is of itself a good thing, and that's a contribution Clive's made to our national debate for a long time, and I hope he keeps making it.
I think Clive would like to do more than just talk about it,
well,
though, isn't it?
That's fair, but at the end of the day, these are things that we do need to talk about, and they should be part of the political contest in a democracy. Now, you know, if the central proposition is we need to do more around adaptation and resilience, absolutely 100% agree, and I think overwhelmingly, as the lived experience of climate change bites on more and more people in terms of floods, in terms of fires, in terms of dislocation, economic inequality, I think more and more people will be up for that conversation. If the proposition is that we should reduce our focus on mitigation, then I'm not here for that, because the more we mitigate, the less we will have to adapt. So you can't remove them from each other.
I'll come to you on that in a minute, David, but I do want to get clarification on that from you, Clive, as well. Clive, you do point out in the book that we have a moral and also economic responsibility to pursue greater mitigation, to get our carbon footprint down, to be able to look at developing more diverse sources of energy. But is it more of one, or is it instead of something else? Where should our priority be? Should our priority be on living well and living hot, or should it be on developing other sources of energy and putting our focus in ways of being able to achieve those targets that you very frankly have said we can't achieve?
Yeah, I mean, this is very difficult. I mean, I went to Kyoto in 1998, and anyone who mentioned the word adaptation would be shouted down, particularly within the environment movement. And that's been the case really up until now. There's still people saying we shouldn't talk about adaptation because it means, we're going to reduce our commitment to mitigation, or give other people a kind of get out of jail card. And so it kind of, it's been quite an emotional jump, I think, for both George and me to say, well, actually, when you look at where we're going, we have to prepare. Well, we don't have any choice. Well, of course we can choose not to, but we're going to suffer a lot more. Well, our children and grandchildren will suffer more if we don't start preparing now. And
but if it's priorities,
yes.
What is more important?
Well, I mean, of course we need to continue to pursue reductions, rapid reduction in our emissions. Although we do make the point, and I'm sure someone in the Australian will jump on this and say, aha, Clive Hamilton agrees with this. It's not going to make any difference to the world. But that's all right, they can do that. But the really kind of challenging thing that George and I say is that actually if we have to slow down the rate of reduction of our emissions in order to protect vital elements of the natural environment and our food security, well then, we just have to accept that. Because if you project yourself forward to 2050, 2060 and think about the Australia we're going to be living in, the enormous challenges that we're going to be under, the pressures from the rest of the world, even if things go relatively well, they're going to be immense, and we are going to value those elements of the natural environment under massive pressure now, and our food security even more. And we don't want to see the rollout of renewable energy infrastructure wiping out some of that food security or our natural environment.
David, I'll come to you on that. Is this a case of having to choose between greater adaptation or greater reduction? Can we walk both sides of that street at the same time, and is there the political will and foresight to be able to achieve those reforms?
I'm not sure about the current political will. You'd have to say there probably isn't. But for me, the gem in this book is the focus on adaptation. We have to get going when it comes to adaptation. We currently have a fund that the government spends $200 million a year, pat themselves on the back. APRA is saying unless we start spending $3.5 billion every year, we have no chance of adapting. But I think the flip side of this is we're dreaming if we think that we can adapt to unmitigated climate change. Yesterday we had a briefing with Joelle Gerges, who was a lead author on the IPCC 6th assessment report. And unless we show global leadership, and I would disagree with Clive on this point. Sure, we're a mid-power, a very high per capita emitter, one of the highest per capita emitters in the world. But we're also in the top 3 fossil fuel exporters in the world. And so I do think we can and should have an outsized impact. If Australia was willing to say we're going to act in line with the science, we're going to stop approving new fossil fuel projects, mainly for export, vast majority for export, and we're going all in. At every single conference, we're going to be shouting about decarbonisation, as is rightly pointed out, in China and India and some of the other countries. But for me, that's the moral dimension to this. So I think we absolutely have to do both. And to think that, well, we'll just adapt, we're dreaming. 2.5, 3 degrees, from what I'm hearing, it's unadaptable in many parts of the country.
Clive did point out, though, that if we were to do that, and I think, Clive, you said you may morally agree with that position, but hungry economies are going to source that elsewhere. China is still building more coal-fired power stations. So while we may take that morally pure approach, in a global world, what impact is that going to have, David?
I mean, this is the drug dealers' defence that consecutive governments have rolled out. But if you look at the time horizon for big new gas projects, it would send a massive price signal and other signals. And, we hear so much about Japan needing our energy security. It turns out now that Japan is exporting more LNG than it imports from Australia. And I was asking DFAT yesterday, what's going on here? We're being conned by Japan that we are critical for their energy needs, but they importing our gas and then exporting more gas. They're essentially becoming a hub and making profit off that. So I think as a country, we have to step up and act in line with the science. We will be judged by future generations on this. And the fact that we might say to them, well, interest rates were high in the economy, it's just not going to cut it for our kids and grandkids. And so I don't know, I think that is where we need to really break that thinking,
Bridget,
that they'll just get it elsewhere.
Bridget, I'll get some thoughts from you on this, because immediately we started out with Michelle saying what the political landscape looks like, and already we've hit forks in the road. Do we go down the adaptation road? Do we choose greater reduction? Do we take a pure approach while the rest of the world clearly is having to service its energy needs, particularly in big growth economies like India and China? So where do you sit on these idea of priorities and Australia's role in a global fight against climate change?
Well, I think you have to do both. I don't think you can just sort of give up on one. I think you have to do both, but I think that we spend a lot of our time focusing on the emissions reduction side and very little time focusing on the adaptation side. I think we have to do both. I think that there is not only that moral imperative, but I think also we are part of a global environment as well, and our economically, I think our place in the world is dependent on us continuing to reduce emissions as well, and making sure that what we are doing in Australia is leading, I think, on those indicators.
But what
just
does,
because
what
we
does
might
leading look like when David says we should stop exporting?
Well, maybe we should stop exporting. Maybe we should stop exporting. And I think we should stop, just lying to ourselves sometimes too, as David said, about what the benefits are that we are actually tangibly getting. Because I think there's a lot of kind of unicorns in the discussion, and as is often the case in politics, I think you get politicians sort of telling people how they think the world is, which is not necessarily accord with the facts at times. So I think we have to do both, and we have to be prepared to sort of take on, I think, some of these, which I think you refer to in the book, Clive, the sacred cows as well.
One of those is nuclear, of course. I mean, when you talk about doing both, do we also have to do more?
More nuclear, or
Is that another part of the mix? It's part of the current debate, and certainly something the coalition's looking at taking when they go to the next election, in being able to pursue nuclear as part of that mix. Is that also something that should be more serious than, well, that is on the table, but is that also something that should be part of our mix going forward?
Look, I don't necessarily know. I don't think we should be off the conversation. I think we should be prepared to talk about all opportunities, and certainly, fairly agnostic in relation to the technology. But again, I think you have to look at it in terms of, what are we trying to achieve? And you've got to be honest about what's the conversation you're having. If you want to pursue a nuclear future, is it because you want to decarbonise? It has to be. You have to be starting from the point of view of recognising a need to decarbonise. Otherwise, keep burning fossil fuels. Why would you bother? And so if you wanted to have a conversation about nuclear, fine, if that's what you need to get you where you've got to go politically. But I think you also have to recognise the facts that there's no place for nuclear unless you have a rapid transition to renewables, and then, you know, some point that might be something that you might want to have in the mix, but not. And that goes back to that question about technology.
Yeah.
Sure, technology can be useful, but you have to decide what it is that you're trying to achieve in the first place, and then utilise the available technology to get you where you need to go.
Nick, your thoughts on that?
Well, a hard no to nuclear. We should be really clear about why Peter Dutton's put nuclear on the table. That's to run interference for the big fossil fuel corporations who are still making obscene profits while they're being run by psychopaths and destroying the planet's capacity to sustain human and other life. Nuclear is too expensive, way more expensive than renewables. We haven't solved what to do with the waste, but critically, it's too slow. Like, you can't bring nuclear power online. Even if you started seriously today, you wouldn't have nuclear power online in the next decade and a half, and we need strong action now to reduce our emissions. Let's do the obvious thing.
This is one of our points. We're so preoccupied with the debate over mitigation, and now there's a whole nuclear debate that's again been thrown into the mix, that it's a way of not thinking about, well, of not accepting that the future is going to be grim. Doesn't matter whether you have 16 nuclear power plants or none.
And you're not opposed to nuclear per se, but you're saying that's not where the focus should be.
Well, I mean, we write in the book, we don't have an in-principle opposition to nuclear, but like the CSIRO, when you look at the practicalities of it, it doesn't make any sense at all. So we don't want to talk about nuclear. We want to talk about adaptation. We don't want to talk about mitigation. You know, we've said so much about mitigation over the last 30 years that we've run out of things to say. And everything we say has been said 1,000 times by others. But, let's not get diverted back into those rabbit holes and those debates and so on, which are stopping us from saying, well, no matter what happens there in Australia, we are going to face real problems in 2050, 2080. Our kids are going to have grandkids are going to have a hard time. What are we going to do about it? And I just want to take up a point that Bridget kind of inferred in her opening comments. The thing about one of the differences between the building resilience narrative and the mitigation narrative for everyday people is that when you're talking about building resilience and adaptation, it's much closer to home. You know, people can see their roads and their houses and their whatever's getting washed away or burnt out, and they're thinking, well, how can we make our community better and safer? And so it's a very different kind of political debate, which is much less prone to people taking ideological positions.
If there's a spare mic, if we have one, I'd like to hear from George at some point as well, if you don't mind, George. If someone can bring a mic down the front, I'll come to George in just a moment. But Michelle, let's just go to, again, because the political realities of this, we know how easily climate has been captured by the so-called culture wars. Have we passed that when it comes to climate, and would adaptation open another front in a political culture war, or is that, as Clive says, something that is much closer to home and something that the public may be more amenable to digesting?
Look, I don't think we've passed the climate wars in sections of the political class. I think that you still have some who are very unhappy about the 2050 target. Sections of the Nationals, I think, are not really signed up to that, even though they were dragged to it before the last election. And of course, one of the motives, not the only motive, but one of the motives that Peter Dutton has in taking up nuclear is to keep the Nationals in the tent and to stop them being tempted to split over this question of the 2050 target. So I think it's as though the climate wars have sort of been won, but there are quite a lot of insurgents around, and they've always got access to a cache of weapons to reopen the fight. On the adaptation thing, though, I think while it has substantial political problems, they're sort of a different ilk. They are problems of cost of getting people's attention, except immediately after a flood or a fire, a crisis there. It's very hard in more normal times to get people's attention, and they've got those issues of governance that I think I mentioned earlier. So they're not ideological at the same level, but they are just really, really difficult because there are going to be winners and losers. It's a bit like tax reform in a sense, and it's sort of the magnitude of massive tax reform.
George, can I just ask you, and I want to come to Clive in just a minute on one of the things that struck me in the book is what China is already doing in terms of adaptation. But can I ask you about what this is going to mean for the way people live? Let's take someone in Lismore, for instance, and we know the impact that they've had with successive flooding. It's going to mean something when it comes to insurance, where people live, the sustainability of towns. It goes to infrastructure. It goes to actually how we connect our towns if we're going to relocate people to other centres. What would life in an adapted Australia look like for a child, a 10-year-old child now in Lismore, when they're 30 years old?
That's what I meant to do. Okay. Well, thanks, Dan. I'll stand up so people can actually see the other author. Yeah, look, we thought a lot about timescales in this, and just before I answer a question, just in terms of timing, Clive mentioned that he and I have been banging on about this for close to 30 years, and in a sense, what's happening now is pretty much what we and other people were saying 30 years ago ought to be happening. So it takes 30 years to turn the great ship of state and the energy system around. And we're trying to begin a conversation so that perhaps in the next 10 years, not next 30, because that'll be too late, people can come to grips with how we're going to have to live. Lismore, for example, is not immune to flooding. And one of the things that people have to deal with is that infrastructure will be hollowed out. So that in Lismore, for example, and we've looked a bit at what's been happening, people can't sell out because in some cases they can't realise the value of their property. The state cannot buy them all, although there are some buyback programs. So what you're going to have is towns like Lismore will become hollowed out. They'll become hard to service because every second or third house in the street will be gone. So the cost of maintaining the road, maintaining electricity, maintaining all the services per dwelling will gradually increase to the point where it'll become a national economic question about how we're going to manage all of this. From the individual point of view, people won't be able to get insurance.
We're seeing that now. People are priced out.
That's right. And one of the news stories, Clive and I sort of obsessively monitor the news about related to climate change, but an interesting one yesterday was one from the real estate company Domain, doing quite good studies on the number of houses in Australia that are exposed to major flood risk, and really high bushfire, flood and coastal erosion, and the value of those, even the highest level of risk, if they all had an insurance claim in 1 year, is about $800 billion. So clearly the insurance industry is not going to privately cover those. So in future, the government, whether it wants to or not, is going to have to get into the business of managing public risk. So both you asked about towns like Lismore, they can't be relocated, they're too big. But things that they have been doing and can do is, for example, one of the major employers in Lismore, Norco Dairy Co-op, it was basically rendered inoperative after the floods. So with quite a bit of government money, I think both state and federal, they've managed to rebuild their factory, put all their critical equipment a couple of floors higher, and essentially flood-proof it. So individually, businesses with government money can be made resilient. I think the big problem will be householders. Eventually, the public, the private insurance will withdraw insurance cover, and that's going to become a big political problem.
Thanks for that.
I just wanted to add to that really quickly. The Greens have just moved in the Senate and established an inquiry, a Senate inquiry into exactly that issue, the impacts of climate change on insurance. And that's part of us trying to be a part of driving the discussion that we're having today. And what's becoming obvious in the early stages of some of the conversations around that is it's not just insurance products that are being sold to people in climate impacted areas, because the risk ultimately parks in the big global reinsurance companies, and they amortise their risk across the full range of the full suite of their insurance policy offerings. So if you're a local bowls club in an area which isn't directly impacted by climate, your premium's going up because all the risk congregates in a very small number of big reinsurance corporations. So those are some of the discussions that we absolutely have to start having.
David, just listening to that, and clearly there are places that are going to be asking serious questions about whether they're sustainable. And one of the things that Clive identified was the problems in getting the various arms of government working together. And so much of this, as you pointed out in the book, Clive, falls to the local government who are dealing with this on the ground. But, you know, we did see during COVID and the COVID emergency for a while, the capacity to come together. But what Clive has described, what George is talking about there, is another emergency. And we're already behind in dealing with it. So how do we get this operating in a way where we're able to be able to create a future for a child born today in Lismore in 30 years from now, when we're starting behind and we have to be able to get the various arms of government working together?
Well, my understanding is we're one of a very small handful of developed countries without a national climate adaptation plan. That's obviously a huge issue when you start to look at the different levels of government and the coordination required. And we have seen some councils doing a lot of work here, but clearly frustrated, small revenue base coming up against planning laws and all the rest. So there is that desperate need for coordination. To the Labor government's defence, and I commend them for it. They have a plan to make a plan when it comes to an adaptation strategy, which is a start. But as Clive and George highlighted in the book,
Well, this is 30 years after they started
this is
talking.
urgent. This is something we need now, and I think we can't overstate how climate is going to shape the built environment, the way that we live, work and play. And I think there's a lot of Australians who are starting to realise that. Climate isn't this big thing out there that we're being warned about. It is the here and now. This is about the people and places that we love. This is about the sports that we love playing. If you look at some of Joel Gergis's work, current trajectory, by 2040, 2019 will be an average year. By 2060, 2019 will be a very cool year. And so if you cast your mind back to 2019, what does that mean? That means likely be seeing 50 degrees Celsius in Sydney.
Well, but wasn't at one
regularly.
point you point out, I think Penrith was the hottest place in the world on one day. And I think sports events have already been cancelled now. We're used to them being cancelled for rain, but because it's too hot.
So I think this is fundamentally going to change the way that we live. And so I think we need to be, reimagining how do we build more resilient communities, and how do we look at things that, one of the other things and full disclaimer, I haven't read the whole book yet, I'm working my way through it. But one of the things that I would love to pitch to Clive and George is around electrification, because I really see electrification as both mitigation and adaptation.
There's a lot on electrification in the book, including the idea that we electrify everything, which you don't think is a good idea.
Well, not necessarily. Not if it goes too far too quickly and destroys things that we love. On the other hand, we can electrify in a way that does make us more resilient.
And I think that's one of my concerns is that the models we're working off, the AEMO models, the Australian Energy Market Operator, is very much the old way. We have generation and then you have consumers. With the technology now, we can actually be producing and consuming and storing energy at a household, suburb, regional town level. And we're seeing in the States, big energy infrastructure is increasingly under pressure. So I really see it as part of both mitigation and adaptation and huge cost savings too for households.
Can I just chip in a point about the built environment? Because the whole pressure at the moment is to fill in our cities, to get more people into the inner part of our cities. But I think Clive makes the point that we need greener cities too. So how does that pressure for a change in the built environment fit in with the adaptation model, which would seem to suggest you need to spread out more?
And we have to look at questions like immigration as well, which we've immediately seen has become a hot button issue leading up to the next election.
Yeah, we stay away from climate refugees because it's just so hard, so frightening, and we've got so much on our plate. Let's not go there. Let cleverer people think about that. But taking up Michelle's point, I mean, one of the things that really freaks out certain people who study these things is when you've got a compounding crisis where you have a heat wave. Let's say you've got Adelaide, it's got 5, 6, 7 days over 40 degrees, and the grid goes out. Huge numbers of people, particularly old ones, are going to die. It's just, people will die in very large numbers. That's what happens. That's what has happened in Europe. So that's the kind of thing that given that the heat wave itself is likely to increase the probability that the grid will fail for all kinds of reasons, or it could be a cyber attack, it could be anything. But we're not ready for that. We don't even think about that. And yet we should be. And one of the ways we can reduce that risk and the damage that it could do would be both to localise our electricity supply, but more particularly, build buildings that remain cool. We used to do it before we had air conditioning. There were buildings that were much cooler than they are now, and yet we've allowed developers and building regulations and so on to develop in a way so that the buildings are hotter, they absolutely rely on air conditioning, and there are no trees around. I mean, this is madness for on a heating planet.
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to finish, Clive, with a thought from you on this. And it is a provocative book, and it does ask us some really serious questions about how quickly we're moving and what our priorities are, and some really confronting questions around whether, in fact, mitigation and reduction should take a back seat to adaptation. And we've already seen today with our panel that that's a heavily contested space. But does it go far enough, Clive? I mean, are we asking something even more fundamental? If you look around the state of our world today, you've got a climate crisis, you've got unending forever wars, you have a democratic recession globally, you have the state of democracy in the United States, the potential threat of conflict with China, and you've written a lot about that. Does it go to something even more fundamental? And that is that we may adapt, but are we foolish to think that we adapt and keep doing what we're doing? That we adapt and continue to try to live the way we've been living? And does it go to a more holistic malaise? And that is that this modern experiment of the last several hundred years has reached a point where that is not sustainable, morally, ethically, economically, environmentally.
Briefly, let me put it this way. In our book, we talk a lot about how the debate in Australia and elsewhere has always been about technology, whereas it's not just technology that can change our impacts on the environment, it's also population and affluence, or the amount per person consumed. No one wants to talk about population because it's a hot button issue. No one wants to talk about reducing growth or consumption. As someone said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And
that's really what you're talking about, isn't it?
And if you put your mind to it and actually try to imagine, it is actually easier to imagine the end of the world, for me. And so there is an opportunity here, and I was speaking with Mark briefly about this before today's event. that if we do it in the right way, and I don't want to be too starry-eyed about this, but, and we're going to do a lot of work at a community level, we hope, over the next years, why could not rebuilding, remaking towns, communities, apartment blocks into climate resilient places also be a way of rebuilding socially and democratically? It could be a way of renewing democracy at a local level. Of course, they can't just do it locally, but where decision making by communities becomes an essential part in the context of a heating planet to how communities get together and imagine and rebuild and remake the places they live in.
Good as it sounds like The Voice. Didn't we have that debate? We won't go back there. Thank you again to our panel. It's such a big conversation. We've only just scratched the surface, but you can read the book, and obviously this is going to go on. So please thank our panel here today. Events like this are not possible unless you have an organisation with the leadership and the commitment to be able to support the sort of work that Clive's done, the sort of work that I do. And we're very fortunate at Charles Sturt University that we live very close to the ground and we live very close to our communities. And through our Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, Mark Evans, and our Vice-Chancellor here today, Renée Leon, I've seen the evidence of the commitment to tackling just these issues, to having big conversations that I've been involved in around the future of spirituality, the future of democracy, the future of our climate. What is a future post-voice for Indigenous people? These are conversations that we've had already. I've seen the launch of things like the Gulbali Institute operating out of Wagga, which is looking precisely at how we adapt to a changing world to be able to meet the needs of our world through agriculture. Whether we look at changes to democracy, the work that Mark's involved in with democratic renewal, and now with the launch of the Yinjamara Nullaway initiative as well, looking at how we can create spaces where we can have really tough conversations without the political polarisation and hatred that often comes, and the cultural wars that often derail those conversations. And it does come down to leadership. So I want to thank the leadership we have at Charles Sturt for being able to support this work, and to introduce our Vice-Chancellor, who is absolutely instrumental in that, Renée Leon. Thank you, Renée.
Thank you, Stan. And what an important point in Australia's national debate and national awareness. Today's launch of Living Hot by Clive Hamilton and Dr. George Wilkenfeld, both Charles Sturt, much esteemed academics, I hope will be the commencement of a significant national awareness and national debate on how we adapt to Australia's future in a much hotter world. Charles Sturt University has been teaching and researching on climate change for many years. Much of our work, as Stan references, has focused on the likely effects of a changing climate on our water and agricultural systems, but also on topics as diverse as climate change impacts on the well-being of regional workers and the psychological impacts that immersing oneself in climate change work can have. In fact, two of our researchers are conducting a survey of scientists and STEM professionals exploring their climate anxiety. This work on how those who know most about climate change cope with climate grief, anxiety, and stress sends a powerful message about the seriousness of the situation we face now and in the coming decades. And so both that history and the challenge that Living Hot is giving us is why today I'm announcing the creation of a new research program to be led by Professor Clive Hamilton. The Living Hot project represents, we believe, a turning point in the debate about climate change and climate mitigation in Australia. So in addition to a continuing emphasis on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and I have to say that Charles Sturt is a leader in that respect, we are Australia's first carbon neutral university, we do need to become much more focused on how we're going to respond to the stresses and the change of global heating that will come our way, and in fact, that is already here. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that dangerous warming of the Earth is inevitable, bringing with it more extreme weather events and social and economic disruption. While we will and must do our fair share in cutting emissions, it's apparent that climate change will affect our lives in Australia for generations to come. We must shift our attention to a sustained program of investment in protecting the country and our way of life from floods, bushfires, droughts, storms, cyclones, and heat waves. And here in Canberra, just so recently, we've all already seen the devastation of bushfires in our favourite coastal holiday playgrounds. As our panels reminded us, even those of us who didn't have a holiday house at the coast are seeing our insurance premiums rise as the cost of climate change affects the entire insurance market. And at the most ordinary level, anyone involved in children's sport or in sport themselves knows how often weekend games are being cancelled due to either floods or heat waves, or not so long ago, air that was so smoky you couldn't breathe. And we're not even at 1.5 degrees of warming yet. So as today's discussion has made clear, building a resilient nation will mean changing how we think about the future and transforming how we live and work. Our leading role as a university in research in agriculture positions us well to support the transitions that will need to be made to support Australia's food security for the decades ahead. Global heating presents particular challenges for First Nations people, particularly those living in regional and remote areas. The Living Hot project will explore the implications of the changing climate for caring for country. And the project will take a particular interest in building resilience in the systems of local communities and local councils. Its research will, we hope, shape the national conversation, not least around the effects of global warming on those most vulnerable in our communities. And let's not forget that climate change will push into vulnerability many people used to thinking of themselves as the well-off. It's only a small step from being well-off to being homeless if your house burns down and you can't get insurance to rebuild. So although Australia is lagging in making preparations for the changing climate, there are pockets of forward-looking activity that hold lessons for the broader community, and our research program will study these and prototypes of adaptation activity by communities, local councils, utilities and businesses in Australia, examples that might serve as models for others and inspire us to think differently. We hope the new Living Hot project will shift the dial on the nation's approach to its climate predicament and help take us all into the next phase, beyond reducing emissions towards preparing for a life in a new and very unfamiliar climate. We know that failing to begin preparing now will cause immeasurable suffering for all of us, and particularly for those least able to protect themselves from the impacts of a changing climate. So, although there is no real pleasure in facing our true circumstances as we are, I do have to say that it is my pleasure today to launch Charles Sturt's Living Hot research program. I hope that those here today will follow and support its work and seek to extend it into the national conversation. Can you please also join me now in thanking both the authors and our panel for a truly important commencement of this national awareness. Thank you.